Welcome, everyone, to the Nerd Journey Podcast, episode number 62. We're joining you every week to talk IT career progression and bring you the advice we wish we'd been given earlier on in our careers. I'm your host, John White, at VJourneyman on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
I'm doing great, John, and highly caffeinated as usual. We are pre-sales technical engineers with backgrounds in IT operations. We hope our career discussions will be vendor neutral, relevant across disciplines, and remain timeless. If you're enjoying our content, please drop us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, tweet or DM at Nerd Journey. Ultimately, we're just two nerds on a journey.
A journey to virtual enlightenment.
So let's take a trip.
Great, Nick. Hey, this is the first of, you guessed it, a two-part discussion with a guest. We're talking with Nick Tolstoshev, and he is having a pretty interesting career as a technical community manager. One thing, before we get into it, I just want to make sure everybody knows that Nick Tolstoshev spells his name N-I-C, and you, Nick Cordy, spell your name N-I-C-K. So that's how you know who we're referring to in the episode. So if I say Nick, it'll sound like Nick. But if I say Nick, it'll sound like Nick. So hopefully that clears that up.
Yeah, I appreciate it. And if John just starts spelling, you'll know he's just trying to cue the right person to say something next. But John and I were actually members of the Spiceworks community and still are. And several years ago, Nick Tolstoshev worked there as the community manager. So if you got the privilege to visit HQ, you might get to meet Nick and see the giant band hammer that he used to moderate the community. And he's just a really cool, eccentric dude that is really open to helping anyone, and he loves what he does. You can tell by just talking to him.
Yeah, in his role as a community manager, I think we'll get into it a little bit, but it's really interesting, the crossover with different roles. But some of the stuff that he's had to deal with, people acting inappropriately, I think we kind of went through, listened to it, and went, maybe we need to cut that out of the episode. So if you ever want to hear those crazy stories, then you need to go seek out Nick Tolstoshev and then convince him that he needs to do either a memoir or an explicit tag podcast, which we are not. So with that in mind, our interview with Nick Tolstoshev, one of the few people we know who has his own feed of crazy pictures of himself. So with that in mind, our interview with Nick Tolstoshev.
Part 1.
Nick Tolstoshev, thanks for joining us on the Nerd Journey podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Hey, Nick, can you just give our listeners a little background about where you work, what you do today?
Yeah, so for about the past 15 years or so, I've been working as an online community manager. And then for about a decade before that, I worked in IT as a sysadmin.
You're really aging yourself there by saying sysadmin.
Yeah, what's the term the hip young people are using these days?
I don't know.
IT pro,
engineer,
ninjineer, rock star.
Ninjineer. I hadn't heard that one before.
SRE. No.
Oh yeah, site reliability engineers. That's a big one. Or what's the other hybrid? DevOps.
DevOps engineer. There you go.
Yeah.
So what does a community manager do, Nick, for people who may not know?
So basically my job is to do a variety of different things, but the main one is to manage an online community and make sure it's thriving and that people are getting along, and also serving as a conduit of information. So summarizing info from, say, if it's a customer community, and taking that to potentially feedback to the product department or feedback to the marketing department. And then in the other direction, when people within the company are like, hey, I need to talk to some customers about something or do a focus group or a beta test, then I'll help them get connected with some people on the community.
Oh, that's interesting. That kind of maybe speaks to my first question, which was why do companies invest in having a community at all?
Yeah.
um, is there kind of a formalized answer to that other than the stuff that you just said?
Yeah, so there's some good data out there now showing that people who participate in online communities as customers will stick around longer, they'll purchase more, and they'll go out and tell their friends and evangelize. So it really makes sense for the business's bottom line to have an online community, or at least some channel to talk to their customers, in an online format. Doesn't necessarily have to be a public community. Some people do that all via social media. Some people might do it, in other fashions.
Interesting. So, if I'm understanding you correctly, if there's like kind of a peer-to-peer community where um, people are, users are talking to other users and kind of collectively working things out, or maybe kind of being mentored in a product usage or advanced usage or even simple usage, then the stickiness of the product and of the company is a lot higher.
Yeah, exactly. So those people are going to stick around because they have an investment, not just in using your product, but in the whole ecosystem of participating and talking with the company and offering feedback and offering to help spread the word.
Do you find that companies that have online communities have that instead of a customer advocacy program that's formalized or in addition to?
Uh, some companies will have those as kind of two separate roles. Some of them will kind of have it all in one. It just depends. That's part of kind of the challenge of community as a newer discipline. Is a lot of companies don't know where to put it in the org. Does it belong under marketing? Does it belong under support? Does it belong under dev and engineering? And I've been in all those different departments at various companies. But I think once the practice matures, it's going to you know be its own department within the company, just like IT would be a department within a company that services the needs of everyone within the company, not just one particular department.
Oh, that's really interesting. I never even really thought about where in the organization something would fall. If it falls under support, then it gets maybe squeezed the same way support does,
Yep.
and it also isn't the maybe the developers and engineers and product management doesn't necessarily see the benefit and isn't as fully invested, because they don't have a stake in it. But if it falls in 100% in product management, then the support people maybe don't see the full investment and aren't fully invested in helping, dropping in and helping people out. I never thought about that. It really does kind of need to be hybrid, or maybe fall under like a customer success organization or something along those lines.
Right. And yeah, it can be a challenge for resources on all fronts. So, like you said, if you're in support, they're typically seen as a cost center, so you get underfunded. But if you sit under marketing, there's money there, so that helps. But if you go to the support org and are like, hey, I'd like to train the support agents that are typically on the phones or an email to participate in the online forum, they're like, well, that's my resources and my head count. So, I don't know if we can make time for that. So it's really important to have advocates across the company who really get community. And I've typically found that companies that have been started since online communities were a thing and where the community grew up with the company, it tends to be more integrated than companies that have been around for 25 years and then started an online community. There's a lot more challenge there in terms of like getting buy-in and getting people to understand, what the benefits are or what the community can do for them.
Yeah, I guess what you really need is a founder who has experienced the benefit of some other online community um, in their job, before being a founder, in order for them to understand it. Like that might be the holy grail.
Yeah, typically you'll have a sponsor, at the exec level who gets it, and ideally that's the CEO. And in my current role at Automox, that's what I have. I have, a CEO who gets the benefit of the community, who has been wanting to build one since he started the company, and now we're finally at the size where it makes sense. So he's really excited and bought into the whole thing, which makes my life so much easier.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And at a smaller company, would someone who does community management also be in charge of managing the Twitter handle, posts on LinkedIn, things like that?
Once upon a time, that was true. These days, typically there's a separate person who's dedicated just to social media. And typically that's kind of marketing the company and stuff like that. Some places, if they're large enough, will have a separate person who just does support type questions on social media in addition to the marketing person. But yeah, those roles have pretty well diverged at this point. So even though I'm at a company of 50, 60 some people, there's someone else doing the social media stuff. And if there's cool stuff on the community, I just feed it to him to tweet about.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you say that, and I just realized that I'm sure that most major, um, like companies with like a end customer focus, like mass market, like an airline or like large national retailer, probably do have people watching. I mean, I know they have people watching the Twitter feed, complaining about things, and who will jump in and say, "Hey, what can we do to help?" And you know, DM me your contact information and I'll see what I can
Right.
do, like that kind of thing. But that's a marketing function. But it is kind of like a hybrid marketing support function, um, but not really community. I get that now.
Yeah, no, those roles, yeah, were a lot more fuzzy. And once upon a time, for a while, social media was hot in the beginning, and then it became kind of a wastebasket job or a first job out of college job. And then they started calling social media managers community managers, and we want you to manage our community on Twitter. And then I think finally people figured out that they were two separate jobs, and the skills, while they have some overlap, aren't completely the same. And your interactions on Twitter are a lot more fleeting than your interactions on an online community, and that kind of makes the biggest difference between the two in terms of how they work.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's interesting because I realize, in being part of VMware's like a V community, um, some of that actually does take place on Twitter, but it's totally anchored in like personalities and
Yep.
people, right? And people with huge networks who have made it part of their personal brand to create like large networks of people that they are connected to, and then are constantly like feeding that community, and that is in addition to their 40 or 50 hour a week job. And
Right.
that's not the same thing as like a formal community management and having like some kind of software platform where people are joining and posting and interacting.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a different dynamic. Like you said, the social media tends to be a lot more broadcast from one to many and then some back and forth, but it's different from the kind of more intimate or ongoing conversation in an online community. And it's also the social media platforms, by their nature, it's harder to have a good conversation on there because technology just doesn't really allow for it. Like even recently, the CEO of Twitter, Jack, had this scheduled online debate with somebody that they were going to hold on Twitter. And by the time they got to the end of it, both of them were like, yeah, this probably wasn't the right medium to do this in. It's very hard to have a conversation in a Twitter thread and the character limits. And it's very hard for anybody to come and follow that afterwards versus a discussion thread in an online community.
Yeah, that makes absolute sense. It's um, like a broadcast medium versus an interactive medium, and different software products have different versions, right? Is it a threaded conversation? Is it not threaded? Like
Right.
topic versus kind of stream. Yeah, yeah, very very interesting. I hadn't thought about that, but the shape of the conversation changes the type of conversation.
Yeah, exactly. And like you said, it's if you do have a fully nested conversation, it's easier to go off into digressions and either go down that rabbit hole or not, or just collapse the thread that you don't care about, versus community platforms where it's more in line and you use a lot more quoting to get around that limitation. So all of those mechanisms will definitely shape the conversation. Are people anonymous? Are they pseudonymous? Or are they using their real names and real life personas? uh, that all changes how people interact in different and fascinating, both for good and bad ways.
I'm really curious, Nick. How did you find out about the community manager role? I know you were in traditional IT before and you must have made some sort of transition. So, can you go into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, sure. So the actual transition happened while I was working at Intuit. I had taken a job there in their QuickBooks Enterprise support department. I was kind of between jobs as a sysadmin, and we were living in Tucson, and they were hiring. So I checked it out, and they're a great company to work for. So I spent a couple years there. Did a year on the phones and support. Did another year of kind of being tier two, subject matter expert and training for the frontline engineers. And then a job opening came up in their community department, and I saw that, and I was kind of like, oh, this looks interesting. Why don't I check it out? Um, but kind of my real first exposure to online communities was back in high school. I ended up getting an internship at the NIH in DC, the National Institutes of Health. Through nepotism. My mom worked there, so she found this opportunity for me to come in and intern and do programming stuff. And uh, that was when I got my first Usenet account. So instead of what I was supposed to be doing, which was writing code, I just spent most of my days online in Usenet, kind of reading various things that people were writing on there and seeing how that community was growing and evolving. And that was fascinating for me because it was a brand new, and B, you had people from all over the planet who were online just kind of helping complete strangers and sharing knowledge. And that online collaboration and meeting people you would never meet in real life was what really fascinated me about the whole thing.
Oh, I was going to ask if you're spending all your time on alt.flame, but you said helping people, so
Yes, well,
that
not always helping. Yes, there was a lot of fun nonsense groups on there, like alt Swedish Chef Bork 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 was one of my favorites.
alt.wesley.crusher.die.die.die.
Yes, yeah, that was another good one. Yeah,
Yeah.
the alt channel was a free for all because anybody could create a news group anytime they wanted. Kind of like you can go on Reddit and make a subreddit about anything. For all the other official channels like the rec and the science and stuff like that, there was a process. So if you wanted to create a group about something, you had to make a proposal, and then there was a voting period, and you had to get like 100 people to say, yes, I think this group's a good idea and I'm interested in it. And then you would get official approval to create a new group under the appropriate hierarchy. So there was definitely a very big difference between the alt group and everything else in terms of how the conversation went.
It's also shows you how long ago when 100 people was what it took.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, this was back, I think, back before most of the major colleges was online. So it's basically, you know, colleges, but the professors and the staff, not the students, and then scientific, places like the NIH. So you were talking with folks from a very specific strata, and then all the students started coming online, and that's when the September influx of newbies happened that eventually morphed into what they call the eternal September, which is when the AOL came online and there was just constant streams of newbies who didn't know what they were doing, who were asking stupid questions. So yeah, that was a rarefied time back in those days.
We'll put a link to the Wikipedia page for Usenet for people who have no idea what we're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. If you're under the age of about 40, you probably don't know what we're talking about.
I love how you said the AOL. That just made it sound so much better. You got mail, by the way.
Thanks.
I'm really curious, Nick, as you go from someone who is kind of a hobbyist and dabbles in these communities for fun, and then it becomes a pretty much your job. Is it
Mhm.
still fun?
Yeah, it is. And I mean, it's the kind of thing I enjoy so much that it's like I spend all day online at work and then I come home and then, I'm browsing Reddit for a large chunk of my free time just because it's still constantly fascinating to me to see the spontaneous things that people get together and organize, like, storming Area 51 or, naming a boat Splashy McSplashy Pants. It's like just that stuff I find endlessly entertaining.
It's interesting now with the growth of places like Reddit. If companies don't provide their own community, I imagine that they're at risk of just having, whatever user group, or user community that's out there just spontaneously self self organize on a place like Reddit or someplace else that where there's less visibility.
Yeah, and my mentor at Intuit, who was, the guy that hired me into the community department, his name's Scott Wilder, and he was the guy who founded, the online community at Intuit for QuickBooks. Um, so he would always say, they're going to have the conversation. If you delete it on your own community, they're going to have it somewhere else. If you don't have your own online community, they'll have it somewhere else. So it's not like you're going to stop the conversation from happening. You want to be in that conversation. So yeah, there's a lot of companies that either don't provide their own online community and then some fan will start one for them, and there may be several, like there's an official Tesla forum and there's like 3 different unofficial Tesla forums run by independent people. And if a company is smart, they'll do one of a couple things. One is definitely engage on the fan communities as well as or instead of your official one if you don't have one. And some companies will even go and make an offer to a hobbyist and say, hey, you built this great online community, we'd like to buy it from you. We'll buy the domain name and we'll take it over. And they may or may not keep that person on as an employee to run the community. So that's a way of approaching it. And just like you've got to have a Twitter handle and a Facebook page and a LinkedIn page, people are going to talk about you on Reddit and on third-party communities. So it's important to keep an eye on that. I use a tool called Board Reader, which is a search engine just for online communities. So it's boardreader.com. And you can go in there and, say you're working for VMware, you can type in VMware and see all the conversations that are going on in online communities, filtered out from all the other stuff that if you just typed it into Google that you get.
Well, that's fascinating. I of course, now that you say that, of course, there's specialized tools for for doing that, but it just never occurred to me, of course, that there would be. If there weren't, then they'd have to be created, right? So,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
can you talk maybe just a second about for you the benefits, personally into your career about getting into that community management space, like for people who are thinking as part of their career progression, like maybe it's something that they want to explore.
Yeah, so I mean, by its nature, you're very connected to a lot of people online, and the bigger your network is, the more chances you're going to have of stumbling across opportunities or someone, thinking of you when they're making a recommendation to somebody about hiring someone. So in that way, it's been very beneficial. I was working at Spiceworks for 5 years, and now I know hundreds and thousands of IT pros all around the world, and if I were ever out of work and like, hey guys, I need a job, that's, you know, hundreds and thousands of eyeballs out there looking and potentially recommending me for something.
How about the cons? Are there any downsides about being in this space?
Um, yeah, so depending on what industry you work in, you will get more or less of this. In a B2B type situation, you get less of it because people are on your community with their professional hats on and their professional reputations at stake. But for hobbyist communities or online gaming, you'll get a lot of online harassment and in some cases even, stuff outside of that, like people tracking you down and doxing you or, sending you nasty letters, things like that. So that's something to know is, in some regards, you're going to be a public figure through this, depending on how big the community is. And, like Xbox has Major Nelson, he's the face of Xbox. So that's this guy's job for life. He's like the Dell guy. It's like you'll always see him and be like, oh, that's the Dell dude.
Are you talking about the dude you're getting a Dell?
Dude, you're getting a Dell. Yeah,
Oh,
that
okay,
guy.
all right.
Again, I'm dating myself. Maybe I
Right.
should use something more current, like the most interesting man in the world. That's his online persona and job for life now.
Like the Gateway 2000 cow.
Yes,
Or
that's never
the
going away.
or the PC and Mac guys that used to be on those commercials.
Yes, that's right.
Very true. Yeah, yeah.
Now you mentioned Spiceworks, so I'm assuming that was a little bit larger community than Intuit, or maybe it was way smaller at the beginning. You tell me.
That's a good question. Trying to think back to how big their relative sizes are. I mean, the QuickBooks community was fairly substantial, mainly because they'd done a good job of enlisting their network of tax professionals, so CPAs and tax preparers who were using the QuickBooks system and using that ecosystem. They had a lot of incentive to go participate on the community to further their careers. So if I became renowned as a QuickBook expert answering a lot of questions on an online community, then people would see in their signature that, here's my contact info. And if they needed help or didn't have an accountant, they could reach out to those people and be like, hey, I need some consulting or I need to hire an accountant to do my taxes for me.
Now, I think, Nick, if you don't mind, can you just tell the listeners how you got to Spiceworks and share that really fun interview story that you have?
Oh yeah, that was pretty epic, and it involves when people ask me like, "What's the closest you've come to death?" I usually tell that story, even though it's probably not literally true, but it subjectively felt that way. Um, so yeah, I was at Intuit, and they had made some changes and reorgs, and they had moved the community out of the support department into marketing, and they had fired my previously mentioned mentor. And so I was starting to see the writing on the wall, and I was like, I better start looking around. Um, so I found this listing for Spiceworks for a community manager, and it looked interesting. Because of my background in IT, it was like, oh, this is a community of people I understand and get. So I applied and talked with Tabrez, and then they flew me out for an interview. So it was just a day long interview. It was kind of like fly in the night before interview and then head back that night. So I hopped on my plane from Tucson, and Tucson's a small town, so there's no direct flights to anywhere. So the stopover was in Houston. As we're coming into Houston, there was a huge tropical storm that shut down the airport, and we didn't have enough fuel to wait it out. So we got diverted to Corpus Christi, and the weather was still so bad there that it took 3 passes over the runway for them to be able to land, because the winds were so bad, even in Corpus Christi.
Ooh.
And it was complete whiteout conditions. So we couldn't tell how, if were we 200 feet off the ground or 2 feet off the ground. And so, we keep making these approaches, and I'm thinking, we're going to crash and burn or we're all going to die. And finally, after the 3 approaches, we landed and kind of caught our breath. And then we made it back into Houston at something like 11 o'clock at night. And the last plane to Austin had left like an hour previous. And they were like, well, we've got a lot of people to rebook tomorrow. We can get you on a flight at like 2 o'clock. So I'd get into Austin after the entire day was over.
That doesn't sound good.
Yeah. So I was like, what do I do now? And then I was like, well, why not go see if there's any rental cars available? So I ran over to the rental car desk and got a rental car, and then just drove from Houston to Austin, which is about like a 3 or 4 hour trip. And I got in at like 2 in the morning, and my sister was living in Austin at the time, so I was staying with her. So I got in late at night and asked her if she would do me the favor of ironing my shirt in the morning so I could sleep in a little bit longer, because I was running on about 6 hours of sleep. So yeah, I finally got into to Spiceworks and did the interviews, and of course that was a great interview story to tell, that I had, taken the initiative to hop in a rental car rather than just being like, sorry, can we reschedule? My flight got delayed. So I think that helped kind of show some scrappiness and initiative.
That's awesome. And obviously you got the job. Now
Yes, I did.
I'm just curious, once you got into that community and it grew into what it was, toward the middle / end of you being there, what are some things that you ended up having to deal with in that community that maybe you never thought you would have to deal with, if you don't mind sharing?
Yeah, so there's a lot of crazy stories from that time. I can tell you a couple of them. One was the guy who came in and joined the community.
Wow. All right. Yikes. I didn't even think that that was something that might happen. And I mean, the sordid underbelly of having to be a community manager. That's
Oh yeah, this you deal with a lot of crazies. I mean, they're a very small percentage of the population, but they take up a lot of time. And there's trolls and scammers. In fact, speaking of photographers, another incident we had at Spiceworks was there was a guy who was a lawyer and a photographer, and his little money making scheme was he would go take beautiful shots of city skylines like Chicago, and then he would post them online, and they would get well ranked in Google because it was a good photo and people liked it and would link to it. And of course, not thinking about copyright issues, people would go on there, download photos off of Google and use them on their website without asking permission. So this guy would do a reverse Google search, find everybody who was using his picture, and then send them a letter asking for $400 for licensing fees for his photo, and more money if you wanted to continue to use it. It was $400 if you took his photo down and sent him some money, so he wouldn't take you to small claims court. And of course, he pitched it just right. I mean, for $400, you're going to eat that with one phone call to your own lawyer if you want to fight it. So it's easier just to send him the money and go about your day, which is what we did.
yikes. I'm hoping that if I go, if I went to law school, that I would do something different than that. But even scammers go to law school.
Yeah, I guess maybe he didn't get hired at the high-powered firm of his choice, and this was all he could think of as a second job. Or maybe he had a law job, and this was what he did for fun or spending money in the evenings and weekends. Who knows?
This is how he funded his photography hobby.
Yeah, exactly. Every time he
Oh
gets
wow.
$400, he goes out and buys a new lens and takes more photos.
Oh geez, this is it's just exposing like my brain and how it doesn't work.
Yeah.
You might call those self-funded milestones, John.
Oh, okay. All right. That's a good point. Did you see, I don't know, Nick Cordy and I both had this, story of like career advancement that came from participating in, communities like Spiceworks. Is that something that you saw a lot, to the point where you can actually advocate it as a community or as a career progression, like tactic?
Oh, yeah. I've seen so many people hired straight out of the community into roles. So Cole, who you may know from back in the early days of Spiceworks, he started as a very active community manager and then got hired to support role there. Same thing with Aaron McCormick. He was an online community member who was very active, and then he ended up getting a job and moving to Austin. I've seen the same thing at many places. Logarithm, where I worked, they hire a lot of folks out of their online community for like professional services or sales engineers. And a lot of those people are now very senior in the company, and they started out as customers, and now they're like, senior principal sales engineer for the Midwest region or something like that.
I didn't even think about that, but of course, I didn't have an original idea. Right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think a lot of people do it. They do it because of the intrinsic motivation. They don't necessarily do it to get a job. But, if you're really passionate about a particular software package and you love it and you think the company's doing awesome things and you get an opportunity out of your participation on the community, why wouldn't you want to go work there if that was a good opportunity?
And isn't the community participation, I mean, even though you want to help people, it kind of ends up being self-promotion for you in the long run, even if that wasn't your intention?
It does. And SEO for online communities is very good because it's constantly changing content, right? No other website gets updated as often as a community platform or social media platform. So there's always new content, and that ranks highly in Google's algorithm. Like, if your page hasn't been touched in 15 years, Google's not going to consider that very important. So because of that, if you Google, the name of the company and any terms, you're going to get results from the online community on the first page. So if you're like, VMware error code 75321, you're going to get VMware's main page, but you're also going to get results from VMware's online community on the first page of Google. So it's going to show and rank very highly, which ends up promoting the company and also having a lot of discoverability. So when people are Googling for online tools to, solve a particular problem, they're going to find your community discussions around it.
Yeah, that's
And
really interesting. I don't know how many times in my life like somebody told me they were looking for, to solve an IT problem, and they're like, the weirdest thing came on. Like I saw your picture in this community Spiceworks,
Yeah.
and you were answering the question that I was, asking, or you were participating in the discussion. And I'm like, wow, that was 6 years ago.
Yeah, I know. And
Yeah.
I get people that recognize me from one community to another. Like when I went to Spiceworks, every so often I'd get someone who knew me from the QuickBooks community who would be like, "Oh, are you the same Nick Tolstoshev?" I mean, obviously, there's no other people in the world with that name, but are you the same Nick Tolstoshev that was at QuickBooks? And I'm like, "Yep, that was me."
It almost feels like with some of the stories that you're talking about, even with like day to day, like people like towing the line of like what's acceptable behavior, much less the stuff that's like just so far over the line, like you were talking about.
Yep.
Um, it almost sounds like it like crosses over with like HR functions. Is that
Yeah.
is that something that like typically, I mean, obviously if I can recognize it, then people who manage community managers recognize it. Is there any specific training that you get, or just pattern recognitions that you start to build up because of that?
Uh, yeah, there's not a lot of specific training out there. In fact, I don't know if there's even a university that has a complete major in community management out there yet. There's a couple places that have courses, and there's a couple professional societies now that offer training and certifications. But yeah, a lot of that you just pick up along the way, either because you have a background in it. Like I majored in psych and computer science as a double major, so the psych aspect of it definitely come in handy. Um, or it's just something that you have a natural inclination for doing. And you do end up doing a lot of kind of social worker, counselor type stuff. Like people, once you get to know them and become friends with them in online communities, you're friends with them, you're confidants. That you'll get people that come to you and tell you stuff they haven't told anybody else yet. Like, I had somebody on the Spiceworks community, come out to me before he came out to his coworkers and his professional network because he was worried about, what the reaction would be. So, part of how I helped him was to be like, hey, I think it's cool. I know all these other people on the online community that don't have a problem with it, and I know are going to completely look at you the same way. And then it was funny because when he finally, I think he went to the next Spice Corps meeting and kind of announced this to everybody present at the meeting. And Hugh, who you all know, was like, "Oh yeah, of course, we've known forever." Like it's pretty obvious. You weren't fooling us, and we've known for all this time. We don't care. We're still friends with you. So, but that was something that he picked me out of all the people in his life to kind of talk to about this and get feedback on it. I mean, I'm sure he talked with his family and relatives about coming out to them, but in a professional setting, I was the person that he thought of to kind of to bounce this off of, which was kind of neat.
That kind of speaks to the kind of relationship that can develop over online communities, right? That you feel like it might be people that you meet like maybe once a year or something like that, but it still feels like extremely close because of this sometimes daily interaction. um, Even if it's like a broadcast interaction, like somebody says this thing and you read it, but you read their like kind of daily, here's what I faced today, professionally, and or here's what I'm going to say to help you to like, overcome your professional like issues. You're still, you feel like you're in a conversation or peripheral to a conversation that that person's participating in every day. So this like sense of community builds up.
Yeah, it does. And there's a dichotomy in the community management world about how far you should go with that. So some people advocate, you want to have good, strong boundaries. You don't necessarily use your real name. For instance, the HP rep, Priscilla, on the Spiceworks community, that's not her real name. She chooses to use a fake name because she, does want that boundary in place of like, this is my professional life and this is my personal life. And the two don't necessarily ever get to meet. And then the side that I more lean towards is more of an integrated approach. So, these are people I've become friends with. I've, have lifelong relationships with. I've had Spiceworkers come stay at my house to visit, multiple different times and occasions. And even, I mean, the most recent example of kind of like both a, being there for somebody in difficult times and also kind of knowing what's going on in their life is there was someone on the Weber community who I became friends with and, was friends on Facebook. And he was one of the core Power User group. And then last year, he posted this weird message on Facebook saying, I just shot somebody. I think I might be going to jail. Goodbye, everyone. And one of his other friends who saw this called the police. And turns out, he wasn't just kidding around. He had gotten into an altercation at his house and he had shot somebody and they died. And he's now in jail awaiting his trial. And because of my relationship with him and knowing what he was going through in his life, he had been cut off from a lot of his family members. So I started like a, fundraiser for him to, help him with his defense and see what was, what we could provide for him in the way of support, and ended up talking to a lot of his family members about what was going on and becoming kind of the hub of information flow between his friends and his family who didn't necessarily know each other, but were all like, what's going on? We saw this message. So, that's something where it's like, I consider that part of the social contract when you become a community manager is like, you're not just here to help these people in their day jobs. You're here to help them in their lives. And if that's something out of the bounds of the ordinary or an extraordinary circumstance like that, that's something where I'm just like, I'll just jump in and see what I can do.
Wow, that's really intense.
Yeah, it was a pretty nuts situation. I mean, and again, this is someone I'd never managed to meet in person, partly because he was suffering from disabling back pain, so he couldn't travel, because he was someone who, and this is one of the great things WebRoot did, was once you reached a certain milestone on the community, they would fly you out for an all expenses paid visit to the WebRoot headquarters. And we basically spend a couple days, throwing them a party and introducing them to people and letting them talk to all these people face to face that they'd never met. So we had two different people on the WebRoot community who had achieved that level. And then this guy ended up being the third one, but he never got the opportunity to come out because his back pain was so bad he couldn't get on a plane.
Hmm. That's fascinating. I don't even know. I'm almost speechless, or actually speechless. But I can't imagine, if that is like the most intense thing, or it's just like, oh no, that type of like intensity ramps up, and it's like once a year something like that happens, or you get deeply involved in something like that. But I mean, I remember even on Spiceworks, people would share stuff in maybe more private forums and saying, hey, I'm going through this really difficult personal crisis, or I'm going through
Yep.
this professional crisis, and people just jump in and pile on and say, what can we do to support you. So um it is one of those resources, like cultivating a network that grows beyond just professional networks to personal networks. And I, maybe that type of thing didn't exist before the internet, and so maybe the world's a better place because of it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people talk about, loneliness in the modern world and the isolating nature of being online, but I have seen these sorts of networks develop that provide that same kind of support that maybe once upon a time you would have gotten from your neighbors or your extended family, or people in your local Rotary Club group or whatever, is now a group of people all over the planet that you're getting this level of support from.
So I feel like the community manager is the perfect mix of HR, counseling, psychology, and maybe ethics all blended into one.
Yeah, the part of the reason I love this job is because it's very much a jack of all trades job. Partly because it's newer and you end up doing everything, and partly because most companies aren't funding an entire community department. I mean, there are some out there, like it's a company called Alteryx here in Colorado, and they have something like 20 people on their community team with dedicated developers and that, and a director of community and a VP of community and all that fun stuff. I think that will become more common and the job will become more specialized. But for now, yeah, I get to do it all, from the day-to-day interaction with people to the project work and interacting with other departments and kind of product feedback, product testing, support. So it's always something different from one day to the next.
Wow, it was really interesting to hear about the different community-oriented roles that companies have, and why they invest in the technical communities at all. But I do have to say that while I was listening to the episode again, I was just staring at Nick Tolstoshev's Flickr photo stream and laughing my backside off at the different creative ways that he has dropped into various events and different types of pictures. Just what a character, right, Nick?
Yeah, fantastic, fantastic guy, interesting personality. And again, you can tell he loves what he does. But I actually liked the fact that he took the hobbyist to career path. So he was already participating in several online communities that you and he kind of had a moment about earlier. I'm not that old, but it reminded me of the area of destiny exercise that we talked about in episode 20. What do you really like to do? Is there a market for it? And he was really able to blend those together. And then, of course, the similarities to what a community manager does and what an HR person does were fascinating.
Yeah, that definitely interesting crossovers and interesting stories. Before it gets too late here, anything pop in your mind before we get out of here?
No, just a reminder that we definitely want people to subscribe, give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. We want to know if we're being helpful and are always looking for interesting questions to ponder. And you know what? If you have questions, we have answers. We have the John White School of Mentoring. So there's no better gift for yourself, your friend, a member of your family who could use that next step in the career. We are collectively on Twitter at Nerd Journey when you're ready to reach out for pricing and packaging information.
All right. Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at Network Nerd _ signing off.
Adios.